Hello and welcome back to Disney Journey. I'm retired Imagineer Jim Shull, and if you've just discovered my YouTube channel, well, welcome. And if you're a longtime viewer, or even better, a channel subscriber, you get an extra warm welcome. On this episode, I'm going to be talking about Mater's Junkyard Jamboree, a ride I got to design for California Adventure and Cars Land. When Walt Disney stood there in July 1955 to open Disneyland, he spoke of lofty ideals, but he left out flat rides. They're not very glamorous, but they are critically important because they're a reasonable cost and high capacity. And with a catalog of rides, you can really provide guest satisfaction.
And it made the park operators pretty happy as well, because the rides may not have costed a lot, but they provided a lot of ride capacity at Disneyland. And it made people happy. When you look at these numbers and do the totals for the cost of these rides, it delivered a lot bang for the buck. And that is why, even in the beginning, when Walt's Mickey Mouse Park was under development in Burbank, across from the studio, flat rides were there. As the idea developed for Disneyland in Anaheim, the idea of flat rides carried over. They started to kind of land in logical locations like Fantasyland. Fantasyland carried a lot of the ride capacity in Disneyland. And for that reason, a lot of the flat rides we take for granted, like a Dumbo or a Carousel, were built and are predominantly featured in Anaheim, California, to this day. That continued when they built Disney California Adventure, and that brings us to Mater's.
Disneyland's flat rides trace back to the trolley and amusement parks of over 100 years ago. Those were inventions of their time, and the emphasis was more on thrill and guest satisfaction rather than safety. They were good, and the best survive even today, but we do have a catalog of rides that were a wee bit too aggressive. When it came time to provide the rides for Anaheim, Walt Disney turned to an option, which were the kiddie parks that were then present. They would go under different names like Kiddieland or Funland, but what was important is they provided a catalog of safe, milder flat rides, and it's to those people who built those and designed those that Walt turned to.
The early Imagineers walked in the footsteps of those who came before them. And even though trolley and carny parks were not held in high esteem, they were recognized for the fact that they provided a lot of ride capacity. And so a lot of the rides which were developed for Disneyland, and especially Fantasyland, were based on those early ride systems. The designers looked into their toolbox to see what they could adapt.
Disney legend Bruce Bushman and Carl Bacon and Ed Morgan from Aero Development drove a lot of the designs and delivered those rides that we find within the park. The men up in Northern California opened a machine shop post-war, and they had a lot of tools and experience building for the war effort in the 1940s. They deployed their knowledge to build small-scale rides for the Bay Area, and they caught the eye of Walt Disney and his team at WED.
The list of rides delivered by Aero are still amazing to look at. 100 years ago, this was a standard for amusement parks. A little bit tacky, but still, you cannot deny the charm that they had and the energy. They did not have environments or stories, but they had everything else, including classic flat rides.
Mater's Junkyard Jamboree is based on the classic whip, and Dorney Park in Pennsylvania had one. And so it came to pass that a group of Imagineers went to Pennsylvania to ride, document, stand, discuss, and occasionally get some stink eye from the operator who wondered, why are all these grown men standing and pointing at this 100-year-old ride? No matter. The information we gathered from that research trip came back to Glendale to become the basis to invent my modern version of the whip.
There's no disputing that the whip was popular, and it was common in amusement parks everywhere. And everywhere it was always the same ride system. Steel plate, castered wheels, spring, open gear, open motor. It was all there. And there was one thing about it that was common as well. And that is that everyone went around in a circle and they whipped outward.
And I don't know why I love the old rides from the thrill parks and the amusement parks and the trolley parks, but I just do. And chief among the rides I love is the whip. I don't know why, because maybe it's the steel wheels of your ride vehicle rattling across the steel plate. Maybe it's looking over and seeing the open gears that are slowly turning, realizing that I really do need to keep my hands and arms inside this ride vehicle at all times. But for whatever the reason, I wanted to bring back a modern version of the whip. And when the time came to provide new rides for Cars Land at DCA, I saw my opportunity.
There was both an opportunity and a problem to be solved. First and foremost, right now the classic whip only allowed people to whip outward in one direction, and I wanted to change that. I wanted bi-directional action. I wanted to be able to whip in and out. But in order to do that, it had to be an invention, and for which I got a patent. Cars Land had the Mater ride in even the earliest of the models. And when Cars Land was announced to guests at Disney California Adventure in the Blue Sky Cellar, front and center was the Mater ride. People got excited because this meant that Cars Land would not only have a major e-ticket, but also a family-friendly flat ride.
Inventing new rides require mock-ups, and mock-ups tend to be crude, at least at the early stages. In the case of Mater's, the mock-up was crude. It consisted of me being pulled by a go-kart, sitting in a chair on casters, in a parking lot, tracing a circle that I had drawn with sidewalk chalk. I was timing the ride, getting a sense of, is this fun enough? And does it work? It was a proof of concept that was successful, however, successful enough to create the next better version of the mock-up, which the executives rode to buy off.
So the buy-off was done and all the lights were green. So I went back to my desk and I started drawing, because the show vendors were about to be unleashed and they needed information, not to mention the contractors, the construction workers, sound, lighting, horticulturalists, everyone you could possibly imagine was about to be unleashed on Mater's. And so I drew. Sometimes I'd have to redraw because, safety, hands and arms inside the vehicle. Zamperla Rides, located in Vicenza, Italy, was the vendor of choice for Mater. I'd had the great good fortune of working with Zamperla on multiple rides that they produced for me, like Aladdin. But in this case, this was going to be a little bit harder because this was an invention. A lot of steel was sacrificed to figure out how to do this, like the transfer plates, because we're going from, disc to disc in order to achieve the directional path of travel. I'm not very technical, don't you? But in all cases, there was a post that came up from the plate, and onto that post was the tractor. And onto that tractor was hooked the cart that guests would be riding in. The cute little cart that the guests rode in was below the plate, which means all that dangerous gear stuff that we talked about earlier, that was well out of reach. And that's a good thing because gears and people just don't mix. But the idea was that eventually everything was fabricated, everything was created, everything was shipped to be installed in Anaheim, California. In the middle of a construction site, a massive construction site, rose out of a former parking lot, Cars Land. And Cars Land was very successful. Day one, it was massive, it was big, but it was meant to be because it was going to be a dominant feature of DCA 2.0. The day came when Cars Land was finished. It was open to guests, and they started to flock in. Lots and lots of guests. In fact, more than 2 guests per vehicle could ride Mater, which was a very good thing because it was 2.5, which makes your operators very happy. Mater's is right in the middle of Cars Land, right next to the old cafe, which was a day one facility at DCA 1.0. If you go today, you'll find that facility, that cafe. You'll walk right by it and never know you did. Guests at Cars Land often hear Maters before they see Maters, and that's because there's a soundtrack that's custom. There are multiple songs which were recorded by Larry the Cable Guy, who is, after all, the voice of Mater. He had a great backup group, and you know what? My favorite song is the one he messed up. He got into one of the songs, started recording, and he forgot the words. Being the true pro, Larry just went with he made up words. And he was backed up by the singers, and it's still the best track ever.
If you strip away all of the cladding, the show, the environment at Mater's Junkyard Jamboree, you're left with a really good ride system, one that's still reliable, proven, sustainable. And whenever you check all those boxes, the other parks take interest. And so it was that Mater's Junkyard Jamboree ride system went into 3 more parks globally. What's interesting is, in each case though, it was a different set of characters that were providing the story, and also different environments for those characters to live in.
Shanghai Disneyland has one of those Mater ride systems in it. This one is themed around Woody because it's the major ride within Toy Story Land. It's a plastic toy set because why not? It made sense to me. And I got a lot of confused but delighted, looks from my Chinese compatriots, my colleagues, the team members, when I would send over box after box of toys that I'd purchased here in the United States because I was trying to replicate something that Andy would have played with. We were successful because, we just worked at it. Everything's plastic here in Andy's backyard. The ride system was installed in another Toy Story Land, but this one is a continent and an ocean away. There at Disney Hollywood Studios is the Alien Swirling Saucer. And it's still probably one of the most questionable acronyms ever for any Disney ride. But moving on, it works the same way as every other version of Mater's, and it provides the same level of delight. And what more can you ask for? Then we head to Tokyo Disneyland because there we find the Baymax Happy Ride in their Tomorrowland. This was a recent addition, and it's one that's sorely needed because Tomorrowland did not have a flat ride with a high capacity that Baymax provided. It has a roof, which causes some noise issues, but you can pad that. The ride is based upon Big Hero 6, and it's cute, and it fits in perfectly into that environment, into that land. And the cast members, they lifted the whole thing up another notch because they turned the ride into a rave, a dance party. There's great music, there's lighting, and there's a lot of encouragement for the guests to get up and dance. So it's a show for the people watching, not just an experience for the people who are riding. Mater may not be the newest Disney ride, but he has a big family tree.
Every time I go to Cars Land, I get a thrill when I see people on Mater's. Their smiles are my reward. I know it sounds trite, but that's the truth, because as William Goldman said, nobody knows anything. When I started drawing Mater's, it was based on my love of the whip, but I didn't know it'd be successful. It could have been, not. But the point is that you step into something with a lot of hope, you put your best work into it, and hopefully, if you're lucky, it'll be a success. Well, we're not out of gas, but we are out of time. So that brings this episode to a close. There'll be another new episode next week. Meanwhile, be sure to subscribe, like, and become a member. Consider it, because every time I get a little bit of contribution, it makes me feel better about the work I'm doing here on Disney Journey. So please, once again, consider supporting my channel. Until the next time, it's goodbye from Lost Canyon.